I'm very happy to be here. It's my second time here, actually. There's a poster on the wall there for a conference that happened in November last year, where I was a speaker, and that was my first time here. And I liked it a lot, and I think the Bug is a very interesting environment, so I was really keen to come back. Okay, so I'm going to talk, and then we can have some Q&A at the end of that for about an hour, and then we'll have a break, and then I want to work with you on relating what I'm talking about to your projects, and I'm going to get you to present at the end of the day, just short 5-minute presentations about your projects. So. Just to explain where I'm coming from in this, I'm not an artist. That's something worth emphasizing, but I am trying to relate to the art theme of today. So I worked on a game called Fable, the original Fable for Xbox, which I don't know if anybody played it originally on Xbox, but it was remade recently. So if you haven't played it, I'm going to plug this game now, because it just came out recently for Xbox 360. And it's a complete remake of the game that we made 10 years ago. It's the 10th anniversary now. So my specialism then was actually the behavior of non-player characters in town simulations. So who has played any of the Fable games here? Doesn't have to be the... yeah. Okay, so those who played it will know that it involved alternating between town simulations with people going about their everyday lives, and going out into the forests and doing quests and sort of traditional role-playing game mechanics. So the town life simulation was kind of my baby in that game, and so we sort of designed it and implemented it. So my background is actually AI programming, but I've moved gradually into game design and also indie games as well. So more recently, I did this indie game, which I'm going to talk about later, with a friend of mine. It was just, so Fable was like 80 people working for 5 years, and it cost about $7 million, I think, or maybe $10 million, which at the time was quite a lot, but it's not now. Renga was just me and my friend, and we had no money at all. But we won the Developer's Choice Award at Indiecade in Los Angeles in 2012 for this game. And as well as Fable being a BAFTA award-winning game, I don't know if you have seen the BAFTAs, but they're a British awards body, a bit like the Oscars. But unlike the Oscars, they have a games awards show. And that just happened last week in London. So as well as Fable being a BAFTA winner, I've just recently become a BAFTA judge. So I was on the jury for the Artistic Achievement category for this year's BAFTAs. And that's something I want to talk about, because I think the nominees for that are quite an interesting collection of games. So although I'm not an artist, I was judging artistic achievement in the BAFTAs. So these games were nominated this year for artistic achievement. The Last of Us, Beyond Two Souls, Tearaway, BioShock Infinite, and Ni no Kuni, which was made with Studio Ghibli, the animated filmmakers. And we had a a longer list of games that we chose from to select these nominees. So the BAFTA members vote for the shortlist, and then the jury meets and votes on the nominees. And then once we'd decided the nominees, we then voted again on who should win. But there were actually 6 nominees. Does anybody know who the other nominee was that I've left off this slide? I think it's very interesting. So these games are very, I think pretty much all those games are very big budget, right? BioShock Infinite, incredibly detailed game art, very, very expensive to make. Not so much photorealism, but this is incredibly photorealistic, right? This is beyond Two Souls. Just that scene must have cost God knows how much money to make, right? It takes so much time to create these things. The Last of Us. Amazing worlds. And you might be thinking, well, you know, I don't have 200 artists and $20 million or something, maybe more like $50 million to make these games. But the sixth nominee was a game made by 2 people called Device 6, and it was for iOS. You don't need lots of devices to run it. It just runs on one phone or tablet. And it was made by 2 guys in Sweden. One of them is actually English and the other one is Swedish. And I met them last week in London. They had no money. They made it in a short time on their own. It doesn't have photorealistic graphics, you know, and a huge art team. It actually mostly consists of text on screen. It's kind of like a text adventure game in some ways, but a puzzle game as well. And it was nominated for Artistic Achievement. And I was really, really pleased that we included this game in the nominations. Because I think it's important to emphasize that you don't need huge budgets. You don't need photorealistic graphics. I mean, I'm sure that earlier today you've been hearing about art design and art style and things like this. And what's great about this game is the design of the art is just beautiful, beautifully done. And it didn't require a huge team. And I highly recommend playing it. Oh, yeah, the other thing about those guys is that they're so committed to beauty in design that even their business cards, I got this in London last week from Simon, who made this game, are beautiful, right? Even this is beautiful. It came closed and had to rip it open, and it has two parts to it, and it's a puzzle. It actually requires you to figure out how they go together in order to find his email address. It's like, it's not obvious. And I just think this expresses their attitude to design, that it's everything, and that it's about care in the details. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Systemic Art Design, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about this word systemic and what I mean by that. So this was a term used in level design by the designer Harvey Smith, who used to work at Ironstorm, who made possibly my favorite video game of all time, which is the original Deus Ex. Fantastic game. And he talked at the Game Developers Conference Europe in London in 2002 about this idea of systemic level design. He wasn't talking about art. Yeah, this is making me feel old. I was at that talk. Yeah, that's surprisingly long time ago now, but anyway, doesn't matter. So it was a good talk, and I still remember it. Systemic level design for him was about having a systematic approach to the design of elements that appear in levels, so that they have a consistency for the player, so that the player could learn, okay, when I see these things in the environment, that means that I can do this. So the game mechanical implications of these elements was consistent. And that consistency and the ability to combine these elements in different ways led to creative space for the player. So they could think logically, oh, okay, so I'm going to use this with this, and that's going to, my strategy is going to be to play this way. And they could apply that thinking consistently throughout the game. So really what he was attacking here was level design which doesn't work like that, where you have special case, one-off, single-use logic or scripts that when the player arrives at something, they don't know what it's going to do or how it's going to work because it's unique. And this is confusing for the player. And actually, I think that that approach of unique cases is something that you see more and more in big budget games, where they have a film-like journey of traveling through this linear pipeline of content. And it's all very unique, and the art is all very custom-made for just that one scene. And it actually undermines the player's freedom, I think, and the player's ability to make creative choices in the game. And that's why I love Deus Ex, because it had different ways you could play, and you could adopt your own strategy. And every level was carefully designed so that you could play it as a straight shooter. You know, you could get lots of armor and fight directly, or you could play it as a stealth game. And neither strategy was dominant over the other. They were both equally valid. So I want to take this word systemic and apply it today to art design. Because I think it's actually very relevant to the design of art in games. And really what I'm trying to emphasize is that no part of game development stands on its own, right? You can't just put the art over there and get an artist to do it. Although you might have to outsource your art to somebody else, you need to look at how it's situated in the whole system of the game. So there are three concepts that I want to emphasize. The first one is that game art will always be dynamic to some extent. If your art doesn't move around, then what is it doing in a game, right? It's great to make beautiful pictures and amazing 3D models or whatever, but at some point they have to move, because they are going to be in an interactive system. And so, of course, there will be elements of your art that are static, that don't move, of course. But at some level, all the art is being driven by code. And the code is going to be, you know, making this artwork appear now and making it disappear, or if it has moving parts, driving those parts, moving them around. And the code is being driven by the player to some extent. So the player is taking actions, the code is reacting to the player's actions, and the code is then driving the artwork. So I think it's very important to think about what are the moving aspects of your art. And okay, you might have a background that is just static. But it's still going to be a static background to some kind of movement, even if it's a static element. The second concept that I want to emphasize is constraints. So this is SimCity. Oh, by the way, that was World of Goo, which is a fantastic game. This is SimCity. I don't remember exactly which one this is. Someone will probably know exactly which version this is. But I wanted to use an older version because it emphasizes the constraints that the artwork is produced in. So I think I'm right in saying that this version didn't have free rotation of the model. So it had fixed views from 4 angles. And the artwork needed to fit into city blocks. So the art design of that game was incredibly constrained because huge amounts of art of different kinds of buildings in different states of progress and decay needed to be made. Huge system of what I would call art assets. Vast numbers of them, and they all had to be rigorously controlled and constrained so that they fit into this system. So that's very obvious in the case of SimCity, but all game art must be constrained in some way. And I think the great danger is to give someone freedom to just do whatever you like with some art production, say. Like to give an idea to an artist and have them go off and just, with a blank sheet of paper, think, oh, it could be like this and we could have all these crazy things, it would be amazing. That's probably going to not work out very well because they're going to come back to a programmer, say, and go, I want it to do this, this and this, and the programmer's going to go, that's not going to work for some reason. Although equally code is constrained by other things. And the underlying theme of this talk really is to look at the whole game as a system and also the production of the game as a system and to not allow things to operate separately. So really that's my third theme, my third concept is integration. So game art is to some extent like the design of parts in engineering. It is making beautiful things at some level, but it's also about a system of moving parts that have to work together. And okay, you might be able to say, well, there's this cutscene where I can do whatever I want and it's isolated. Okay, maybe. But all the real core art of your game has to integrate. So, for example, the menu style could be different to the in-game art style, but ultimately you're going to be switching between these two things in one interface, and ideally they will play off each other, work together. Device 6 is a beautiful example of integration because they took the text of the game and they made the text into the play space, essentially. So you scroll around this virtual page and the interaction elements are integrated into the page. It's quite difficult to describe, but I highly recommend checking it out. So, I don't know if you were aware of the industry joke that was Duke Nukem Forever. It was aptly named Forever because it never came out. Actually, it did come out in the end, right? But for a long, long time, it was just the joke of the industry, and everyone in the industry was always laughing about this project. I feel very sorry for the people who worked on it, but it was in development for like 10 years or something. And it was just, it seemed like it would never come out, although it did eventually get finished. But one of the big problems that they had on Duke Nukem Forever was that they took a long time to make a version, and then the industry had changed. The industry had moved on. The platforms had become more powerful, and engines had changed, and they somehow found enough money to keep moving what we would say in English, moving the goalposts. So changing the target all the time. So they would make a version, maybe 2 years, and then say, you know, the latest games coming out now look much better than this. So let's start again and you know, redo all our artwork and make it better. And then they just kept doing that. So the game went through many cycles of redesign of the art to. And like the games that they were competing with were completely different by the end of development than at the beginning. And I think that shows the danger of having no constraints or having too much money. Actually, it can be a really bad thing because it allows you to keep expanding your ideas. So I think constraints are really a blessing in design. You must have constraints in any kind of design process, and not having them is terrible. So just to finish this core section, I wanted to talk briefly about Tearaway, which not a lot of people have played, sadly, because it came out on the PlayStation Vita. So there aren't many PlayStation Vitas. Does anyone have a Vita? Yeah. My friend Rex will be very pleased. So don't take this the wrong way, but I was on the jury and I know the person who made this game, but really I was neutral, honestly. So this is my friend Rex Crowell, who was creative director of Tearaway. And that was taken last Wednesday in London. And so he'll be very pleased that you have a PlayStation Vita, because not many people do. Although I imagine that they will probably port the game somewhere else in time. But it's a Sony published game, so it will stay on Sony platforms. Okay, so Tearaway is a game in which everything is made of paper. And when I say everything, I mean everything. They took this core idea of a world of paper and they just went all the way with it. It's such a complete, consistent vision of that core concept. So, your avatar is made of paper, the world is made of paper, and everything about the way you interact with the game communicates the dynamic qualities of paper, actually. So making things out of paper. And the collectibles that you get in the game are actually designs for real paper models that you can print out and then fold them up and make them and then have it on your desk. And those are the collectibles that you get in the game. So this created a lot of problems for their engine team, I'm sure, because like, what's the worst thing to render in a 3D engine? It's the edge of a flat surface. Having surfaces that are infinitely thin is really bad for 3D graphics for various reasons that I won't go into. But they had to, design their whole engine around this problem. And it's a beautiful example of a complete system of art design. Okay. So I'm going to talk now about Renga, this game, which is the game we made that won an award at Indiecade. Just as an example, really, of applying these ideas, or of relating these ideas to a project. And what I want you to do later is to try and do the same thing. I mean, you don't have to copy what I'm doing here, but it's just an example. So this is a quote from something that someone wrote about our game. People wrote some really great things about it, and I deliberately haven't showed you the game yet, because that sounds like it must be really beautiful, right? It must have amazing artwork. You know, who are the artists on this game? That is the art style. It looks terrible. I think this is my game, right? So I can say it looks terrible. Really, really simple. Very basic. That doesn't look like a spiritual experience, right? But I'm showing it in that way to take the art out of the context, really, of the whole game. Because if you look at it like this, it doesn't actually express what the look and feel of the game was, because you never see it like this when you're playing the game. So I will try and show a video in a second, so that you can understand what I'm talking about. But just to emphasize the constraints that we were under. We didn't have any artists at all. We're both programmers, and so that's a major limitation. And also, as you'll see in a minute, this art style is covered in laser light from the audience, which I'll explain this in a second. Which means you never see the art on its own. You never see it in isolation. It's always with lasers. And also, for reasons I'll go into in the next slide, we needed a dark background in our graphics. That was very important. So, finally, we also needed the game graphics are the interface, basically, as you'll see in this video in a second. So we had all kinds of limitations and constraints, and I would call this making a virtue of your constraints. So we just said, okay, that's just the situation we're in. What can we do with that? Rather than thinking, oh, if only we had an artist, you know, it would be so much better. Or how could we change the technology so that it didn't need a dark background or whatever? We just went, fine. These are our constraints, so let's design around that. Let's design something for that. So we went for a very abstract art style with geometrical shapes that is what's also sometimes called programmer art. And we set it in a kind of space setting, although it's not very literal, but it has the dark background is just a star field. And we made the control points part of the design of the enemies. So that gives you a slightly better sense of what it looks like. So this is actually a crowd game played on a giant projection screen where everyone in the audience is given a laser pen. and they shine it at the screen. So each of these dots is a player, one player. And so it was a 100-player game played at a live event. So this was actually the show that we did at Indiecade in Los Angeles, and hopefully... Ah, great.
Extend from current law.
So this video is like 10 minutes long, but I'm just going to jump through it to show you different parts of it. Oh, okay. So this is, for example, this is the players building walls. Everyone's really happy. So the atmosphere was a big part of it, the crowd atmosphere. And people were screaming and arguing and all this stuff. And as you can see, the main feature of our art style was not in the screenshot that I showed you. It's really all this stuff, the lasers. So they're very, very excited. This is an enemy here. Woo. So the enemies were incredibly simple geometrical shapes. Ah! But they needed to be simple because the players have to use the points around the circle to control make a formation. So it was very important for us that the control points had to be very clear. I think they get this one. Woo! So, and then later on, so this is the finale, the final scene. And it really just boils down to a bunch of concentric circles at the end. It's very, very simple. There they are. So these concentric circles are the final boss that you have to defeat at the end of the game. So it consists of little more than a set of rings with control points which are themselves just grey circles. And connecting the grey circles are these straight lines. I mean, like, the art style is incredibly simple. But I think it does actually look really beautiful. Just seeing the swarming kind of behaviour of the crowd. And they get very excited at the end, so I'm going to let that play. the last one now. That's why my T-shirt says "You were awesome," because it's the thing that it says at the end of the game. So we had zero art resources, basically, no art, essentially no art at all. But I'm very pleased with the result, obviously, and you never saw the game art on its own. You always saw it with lasers, and the whole context of the piece was a live event with an audience, and the atmosphere and the music and all this kind of thing. Everything working together to create the feel, the experience of Renga. Okay, so yeah, sure.
I just wondered, did you use the camera to detect red dots?
Yeah, that's why we needed a dark background, because we had a camera pointing at the screen, yeah, and we were doing image processing 60 frames per second to detect where all the lasers were. Yeah, it was actually very accurate. So we did some bandpass filtering on the light to isolate the particular frequency of red light, which helps. But still, it was best to have a dark background. It helps the tracking.
So yeah. There is no red color on game?
No, there is actually, because the laser light is so much brighter than the projected image that it didn't matter. We could have red, yeah. Yeah, so sometimes we needed to put the camera behind the screen as well in rear projection setups. Well, it depended on the situation, but the lasers are so bright that they actually shine through the screen, so we could have the camera behind it. Yeah, so that particular show was actually an outdoor screen in Culver City in Los Angeles. Yeah, I think it was the only outdoor show that we ever did, actually. But it was also, I think, the best atmosphere that we had, because this was something I forgot actually. It was a clear night, so there was a starry sky above us, with this outdoor screen with the star field. It was so beautiful, you know. So that became part of the design, if you like. But we didn't design that. We were lucky. So I just wanted to emphasize this point about constraints again. So I think there's a great history in games history of using constraints. You know, like this is Jetpack for the ZX Spectrum. You may not know, but I think I'm right in saying that Jetpack was made by Ultimate Play the Game, who later became Rare, who made games for Nintendo, who were then bought by Microsoft and now make games for Xbox. And they've done a lot of Kinect games recently. But they made this a long time ago. So the Spectrum had a major limitation on the graphics because it was color, but the way the color palette worked meant that you had to define regions of the screen and what color you were using in that rectangle. So you only had 2 colors in each rectangle, but you had lots of colors on the whole screen. So if you look at Spectrum games, they all exploit this limitation in some way. So you can see here a boundary between a red region and a green region, and there are no parts of the screen where there are 3 colors in one place. But everybody that made games for the Spectrum just lived with that. You know, they just developed their ideas around that limitation. Elite, for originally on the BBC Micro, was an incredible achievement because it had 8 galaxies with thousands of stars that you could travel to. And every star system had a name and it had a description of the economy and the politics of that particular star system, and like funny little descriptions of the food on that planet, and the government of that planet, and so on. Thousands of stars. The whole game ran in 20K of RAM, which is an insanely small amount of that's like smaller than an empty Word document, like with nothing in it. That's bigger than 20K, probably. And the way they did that was they generated the descriptions of planets procedurally, using an algorithm that, with the right seed, would always produce the same output. So, in fact, they actually told their publisher, Acornsoft, at one point, hey, because we have this generative algorithm, we can make thousands of galaxies, you know, millions of galaxies in the game. And the publisher very wisely said, don't do that, because the players won't like it, because they will feel less meaning to each galaxy if there are millions of them. Just make it 8 galaxies. And so the only reason why there are 8 galaxies in Elite is just to give the player something they can get their head around. And when you get to the second galaxy, it really feels like a big achievement, because you know that there's only a small number of them. The Sims is interesting because it had, the original Sims had many expansion packs. I think this is right in saying that this is all of them. There were 7, the original game, and 7 expansions. But I saw Will Wright talking once, the designer of The Sims, about why there were 7 expansion packs. And that's because every time they brought out a new expansion pack, they had to test it in QA, right? Rigorous testing of all the problems with it, potential problems. But they had to test it when they brought the second expansion pack out. They had to test it with the original game and just this expansion, and with the original game and the first expansion, to see if that made any difference, like with bugs. Then when the third one came out, they had to test it with just the first game, with the first game and the first expansion, with the first game and the second expansion, but not the first one, and with the first game and both the previous expansions and the new one, and so on. So you can imagine that when they got to 7 expansions, the number of test scenarios that they had was insane. And that's why they stopped at 7, because of the combinatorial explosion of combinations of having these expansions. So they just said, okay, we'll make 7 and then we'll stop, because it's just not worth testing more. Doom is very interesting because although the world is 3D in the original Doom, the map is not 3D. The map is actually 2D with height information. So you can go up steps and down, you can have lifts and things like this, but you can't have a tunnel that goes under another tunnel. It's impossible in the engine they were using because of the way they were representing their map data. Well, this was something that Duke Nukem, the original Duke Nukem, could do, that Doom could not do, which was have crossing paths. But Doom was still a better game. Although I liked Duke Nukem. I haven't played Duke Nukem forever, but yeah, it's a classic. So rather than wait until they had enough technology power to do this, they just designed the game around that limitation. And it's not very obvious when you play the game that you never go underneath something else. But you don't really notice, I think. So there's a great book about constraint-based game design, way back on the Atari 2600, which is a fantastic story of people working in incredible constraints, called Racing the Beam by Ian Bogost. I saw David Crane speaking at GDC a few years ago, who made Pitfall for the Atari 2600. And it's just insane, the constraints that they were working under. But they still made some great games. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and we'll have a break in a minute. And after the break, I'll talk about what I want you to do in the workshop. But before that, are there any questions?
Where can we play this game?
Renga. Yeah, sadly, it's very difficult to get to play it, right? Because it's not only a live event, which requires requires the technology to be there, and it requires the crowd and so on. But it actually also requires the live input from me and John. So it's actually a kind of performance. So we are actually controlling the game, like kind of moderating the game while it's happening. So we have to be there as well to do it, which means that very few people have ever played Renga. I think there's probably about 2,000 people who've played it. We maybe did 25 shows over a year and a half. And the last show we did was in New York in February last year, so it's been over a year now.
In a way, we can say that it's a kind of interactive storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, something that we didn't really talk about very much with our audiences, because we didn't want them to think too much about it, but the finale, which I showed, had the music building to the crescendo at just the right moment, it seemed. That was very carefully arranged by John, so that the audience got the right kind of wave of feeling to support the timing of the ring destruction. So actually, the speed at which they could destroy the rings is something that we were changing while they were doing it, so that they would destroy the ring at just the right moment in the music. That's not something that we talked about very much, though, because that undermines the feeling of control for the players.
It doesn't matter. As you, if it gets the job done, in order to give the audience the feelings you want them to feel, it's fine by me.
Yeah. So I don't think there will ever be another public show of Renga. I'm sorry. I don't know. Maybe one day.
Can I say a question?
Yeah, sure.
Most of the time during the presentation, we talked about the constraint that was given by the hardware. But like when I was after I played Last of Us, I watched the devlogs of the developers, and they said that they spend a lot of time just to stop people giving the loading screen. So they had a huge problem of garbage collection. So what do you think about the constraints that were put there by the own team? Like, do you think that it develops the creativity?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you get a publishing, a licensing deal to make a game for one of the game consoles, like an Xbox publishing agreement or a PlayStation publishing agreement, they have these huge documents of requirements that you must comply with. Like on PlayStation, for example, there's a consistent pattern to what X does on the controller and what circle does. And this is a legal requirement of your agreement with Sony, when you publish on PlayStation, that forwards in menus will always be on X and back, I think this is right, back will always be on circle. And if it's not, then they will reject your game at test, and you can't release it. So one of the constraints, for example, we had on Fable with Xbox was a bit like that loading screen problem, that Microsoft required that the screen always had something moving on it, even while loading, to show the player that their Xbox hadn't crashed, that it wasn't just locked up, right? So you weren't allowed to have just a static screen while loading all this data. So we had to have a little graphic that animates. That's why every game on a console will always have some little animating graphic. So you know your console hasn't just died. And it's a requirement of Sony and Microsoft. So those kind of there were huge numbers of constraints like that, which aren't all very inspiring or creative, you know, making you be creative. Some of them were just really annoying and a big problem for us. But yeah, I'm not saying that all constraints are good or that they always inspire creativity, but yeah, they're everywhere you look.
Yeah, I was gonna ask a similar question. Like some constraints give us not only creativity but sort of a challenge to overcome, and like furthermore into it's I don't know, generating new technology, new art styles, new animations, maybe better models and stuff. So it's not only so we have to actually choose the constraints that we want and the ones that we want to overcome.
That's right.
Or is that a goal, like in every game?
And you could say that the development of PC graphics hardware has largely been driven by video games over the last 20 years. And it's because people want to exceed the constraints that they're working with. Very often, like if you're working on very graphics intensive projects, typically the developer machines will have crazy graphics that are way better than the consumers' machines, because they're anticipating that by the time we finish this game, consumers' graphics will be like this at an affordable level. Yeah. So of course, it wouldn't make sense to just say, if you need an artist to say, I don't have an artist, to say, well, let's make a virtue of that constraint and not try and get an artist. That would be crazy, right? I'm not arguing that you shouldn't overcome those constraints. But yes, I think you're right that you have to make choices. That's a very good point, actually, that to think, okay, what are the constraints that we're going to make part of the design? And what are the things that we're going to try and overcome by maybe changing our engine or team or time scale or whatever? Yeah.
The thing you emphasized, having no constraints at all, was a really bad thing. I think that's really important, because some constraints should have been there and never overcome, because we don't get to see much games like Deus Ex anymore. I mean, if any of us went to and played it right now, we would feel, oh, but this animation seems crappy, or I can go there, why can't I open it? But it's brought with it immense content, and by it, I had to play it 5 or 6 times, the first level, in order to get the feeling, you know, okay, it's okay to go on with my choices and do this and do that.
Island,
When you did that without, you know, having to, you know, achieve everything, you know, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to shoot this card, I have to go by stealth and over there. It was a really satisfying experience. Let me tell you this. And it was the constraint of the time that brought it with it. And after that, what did they do with the sequels? More advanced graphic, more advanced blah blah, more advanced technology. Exactly. But where's the context? Where's the immersion? I mean, I'm missing that. Like,
the second game was massively disappointing, actually, after the amazing first one. I think the recent one, Human Revolution, was quite good, but it was kind of an homage to the original in many ways, made by a different team, trying to recreate the feel of that first game.
Not just the Deus Ex franchise. I mean, even you can see it with the Diablo 3 example, and a lot of games are. They are just missing the content, context, and they just, you know, hanging on to the technology.
I mean, actually, that's a subtext to my talk really is that I don't like the way that the big budget games have gone more and more towards this cinematic experience and this kind of roller coaster ride of just look at all the pretty graphics as you go through it. And like every scene, some tower is falling over or something that cost millions of dollars to make, and it's gone. You never see that tower again. And someone worked for months to make that model, right? It's crazy.
I can understand the critics' enthusiasm when you first play your game and when you call it a spiritual experience, because it is an experience. I mean, the cooperative things, we were speaking with my friend over there, all of those laser pointers were looking like they are representing the will of every human being over there, and they are working cooperatively for one purpose, one object.
Yeah.
It's perfect.
You're making me sad that we're not doing any more shows.
We're sad as well.
You're making me sad.
Tonight we can do.
Yeah, well, I didn't bring it with me. So, so the whole show fits into 2 flight cases, about this big, that are like the size that you can check in on a plane for your checked bag.
You're inspiring us to do the same. It is enough, because all we have been hearing for this past weeks were this how to get to work with the industry in the industry's norms, and our creativity was just strangling to be alive. I feel more alive with this.
Great.
Can I ask one thing about the experience though? Like, were there any people who was like stepping up and leading the teams, like dividing, like go left, go right, and
So there's a great story about that actually, which was at the Sheffield International Documentary Film Festival. Bizarrely, we did a show there. There was a woman. So in the game, there's a voice, which is a robotic voice that's talking. You probably heard it at the beginning of the video. So something we don't make obvious at the start is that we actually have live text to speech. So I could actually talk to the audience live, but we don't make this obvious at the beginning. So it's kind of a surprise that happens later on. And this woman who we'd met, actually, we knew her. She got up and stood in front of the screen and started pointing at things like this, going, do this, shouting at the audience. So I typed on the robot voice, you do not have to listen to this woman. And the audience went crazy. And she was really embarrassed, and she sat back down. But we felt like we could do that because we knew her, so it wasn't too cruel, And actually, we had dinner with her afterwards. So there were always some people who would try and. I think that's the only time someone stood in front of the projection. But there were always people who would become very vocal, in the crowd and say, "We should all do this." The game involved defending your base while also collecting resources. And there was a show, I can't remember where it was, where someone was like, all the guys do the defending and all the women do the collecting. And we were like, what? It was really strange. But there were always things like that happening, yeah. And the rest of the audience would get annoyed with those people usually, Yeah, it was like a social experiment, the whole thing. Yeah. All right, thanks.